Glen is going to be talking to us on risk management beyond the science, and he's the General Manager of the Risk and Management and Intelligence branch of FSANZ. And the branch includes food technologists, social scientists, food scientists, nutritionists, economists, and it focuses on the legal, policy, economic and social contexts that shape FSANZ decisions. So welcome to the seminar, Glen.
Kia ora Sue, haere mai te mana, kaonga kai, ahi te reira me Aotearoa, haere mai te Aotearoa te reo Māori. Great to be with you, and thanks Sue for the chat last week. I was challenged recently to have a chat to Sue and get stuck into this issue, this thorny old issue of why there's a difference between commercially set standards and the standards that government sets. And thanks Kath for that challenge, for that wero, and looking forward to taking you through a little bit of that. So without further ado, this is the globally accepted risk analysis framework. It's endorsed by Codex. It's pretty much how food standard setting regulatory government bodies around the planet go about their business in terms of setting standards. On the left, the first circle there, risk assessment. It's all the hard sciences, in particular the dietary modelling type work, the toxicology, the microbiology, and a whole bunch of different ologies and as I say, well-established scientific disciplines. More there than I've listed. In the middle, on the circle on the right, though, is the risk management piece. And keeping with the topic of today's theme, risk management beyond the science, I'm going to be explaining that perhaps risk management is more of an art than a science, and explaining why that is so and why you should be all feeling really excited and comfortable about that. So I'm the General Manager of the Risk Management and Intelligence branch, and the job here at FSANZ is, particularly in risk management, is to, for any given situation, firstly establish the context and then commission the risk assessment work through specifying some risk assessment questions that sets the scientists up to go and do their work. Those questions can be iterated should there be something discovered down the track, and they're always discussed and agreed before we go. It's not about risk managers dictating stuff, but certainly those risk assessment questions are key to the whole process. So once the scientists have done their fantastic work, we then get stuck into the rest of the process, which is really all about taking all this right-hand side stuff into account. And they're things, as you can see there, they're really about the law, the policy, ministerial policy guidelines or ministerial policy guidelines, depending on whether you're a policy person or a FSANZ person. Yeah, certainly the economics of any given state of affairs, labelling matters, and of course what our Act says. And you know, being a good public servant, we're always all about ensuring that our actions are lawful, that they conform to the statutes, that they're obviously compliant, and therefore that they can withstand challenge down the track should that be the case. A key part of this whole process is something, the last part of the diagram that I haven't talked about, and that's the bit that flows across both circles there, this very important process of risk communication. And been really pleased to see the progress that the New Zealand Food Safety Science that one. Thanks, Kath, your team have been putting in terms of risk communication. It's critical to the direction we're heading. Thanks. So I want to take you through very briefly A1193, a recent application that was put before us regarding the irradiation of fruits and vegetables. Old news, I hear you say. You're right. Since 2004. We've been considering applications to irradiate various types of fruits and vegetables, and approved 26 of those via 14 separate applications since 2004. Then sometime in 2019, the Queensland government said, well, do we want to play this game one fruit or one vegetable at a time, or should we just, you know, the science is settled, let's get stuck into this, let's just be done with all these endless individual fruit and veggie applications. And so the application sought approval for all other types of fruits and vegetables. And as I say, the science has long been settled on irradiation. There's nothing safer, really safer than skydiving. And this should be pretty straightforward. But wait, Stakeholder submissions, big number there down the bottom right corner of the first table, 480 submissions. Now that beats out our typical submission number by about 475. Yep, we average about 5 submissions for all our other applications. This time we've got 480. And if you look left of that big 480 number, you'll see that 456 of those submissions were unsupportive of that particular change. And the table below there is the range of issues that people were concerned about, largely private individuals. Yes, some of them may have been persuaded to make a submission through a Facebook group or whatever, but we received, as I say, 456 out of 480 submissions opposed to the idea. So what did we do with it? Good question. We went through and itemised, I think it was about 216 different individual issues raised in those submissions, and we categorised them, we teased them out, and we explained particularly what the evidence is in relation to those, and essentially pointed to the science in terms of why people shouldn't be concerned. Pleased to report that the board accepted our logic, the hard work of staff within the agency to rattle through all of those. And just last month, ministers agreed to that particular board decision as well. So that's now in the code. The irradiation of all fruits and vegetables is now approved in the Food Standards Code for both countries. Another recent event I want to talk to you about, and this goes back to what I was saying about the FSANZ Act and ensuring that we are compliant and that anything we do can withstand a courtroom challenge. So when we're setting a standard, we have to have regard to 8 particular things. The first 3 are listed in priority descending order. So we're always all about protection of public health and safety, and I think everybody would think that that's a good idea. Depending on how you define that, that's another story for a different day. But these first 3 things is the key things we must have regard to when we're establishing a standard. Then we have to have also have regard to the remaining 5 things there. So risk analysis using the best available scientific evidence, consistency between domestic and international standards, an efficient and internationally competitive food industry, promotion of fair trading in food, and policy guidelines, or policy guidelines if you're from FSANZ, policy guidelines if you're from a group that sets policy. So this is about application A1155. HMIO stands for human milk identical oligosaccharides, and essentially we are giving ourselves a scorecard for, in terms of the first criteria there's no issues with the safety of these products, enabling informed consumer choice. Well, it's an optional ingredient, will be labelled so consumers can make a choice about that. Certainly no concerns raised about preventive misleading and deceptive conduct. And we rattle through all those. We give ourselves pretty much an A. Well, we get down to policy guidelines, we find a clause, and there was some concerns raised in submissions about whether or not we met fully the intent or the argued intent of a particular clause in a particular policy guideline. So we generously gave ourselves an A- there. As I say, 100% conformance to one particular policy guideline and all but 99% with the other. The issue as it came down to it is how much evidence is needed to demonstrate benefit, and the result, not enough in the eyes of ministers, and they amended the recommended standard there to exclude toddler milks. So just an interesting little occurrence that I want you to hold in your minds for now, thanks. The scientific view of risk, quite simply, it's about likelihood times severity, simple multiplication there. Risk is the product of probability times consequence. And what happens when you do that, you rate things 1 to 5, likelihood times severity, and you end up with a risk landing in one of these either green, yellow, red boxes. Isn't that fantastic? It's so straightforward. Thanks, Catherine. But however, people view risk slightly differently. There is this phenomenon that's known as outrage, and in particular, the psychologists have waded into this in the last sort of 20, 30, 40 years in terms of, well, scientists, that's great, but consumers, the general public don't quite view risk in that way. And that's one of the key psychologists in helping us to understand this phenomenon of outrage is Robert Zajonc, who argued that essentially we get quite reflective when it comes to how we assess a situation. That's born out of the fact that we once were reptiles and we had to adapt to, the first part of our brain is a very reptilian part of the brain called the amygdala that develops first, and that's all about flight or fight, essentially keeping us safe, keeping us alive from when we faced existential threats in the forms of, I don't know, dinosaurs or saber-toothed tigers, etc., depending on the view of the world, I guess. But certainly Robert Zajonc argued that this reptilian response can actually overtake what we do at the front of our brain with our prefrontal cortex, and that is thinking. So some emotions skip the thinking part of the brain. There you go. That's great. Thanks, Kath. Paul Slovich, another psychologist who helped us better understand and better discern risk, came up with this quite sensational statement, I think, and that is that lay people sometimes lack certain information about hazards. However, the basic conceptualization of risk is much richer than that of experts and reflects legitimate concerns that are typically omitted from risk assessments. And why is this? And that's because in the eyes of the consumer, risk is very, very personal. You're the one eating something, you're the one owning that risk. Thanks, Catherine. So outrage that I spoke of before, this driver of risk perception, it really just separate how scientists do risk and how it's received by the public. And the discerning factors really are, is the risk voluntary or coerced? If I choose to smoke a cigarette, for example, then that's my business. I'm prepared to take that risk. Whereas if something is sneakily put into the food supply, which doesn't happen because of the Food Standards Code labelling requirements, and you get no choice around that, then that would generate quite a bit of outrage. So all of these things on the right-hand side generate the outrage. All the things down the left don't. Natural, we trust things that are natural, don't we? But put a 3-digit food additive number after it on an ingredients list, and people start getting suspicious. So that's essentially the work of Peter Sandman, who American psychologist who actually spent some time coming to New Zealand and Australia in the last 20 years or so, and is quite instrumental in helping food regulators learn about outrage at the turn of the century. Thanks, Catherine. However, there's another way of viewing risk if you're a member of society, and this is perhaps exacerbated by the explosion in information that is generated by social media, and that is this idea that risk equals OMG times WTF. We're conditioned, aren't we, to be afraid, to be wary. We've got our reptilian brains on the lookout for us to keep us safe and alive at all times. But slowly but surely, we're getting worn down. If you go back one, thanks, Kath, by this concept of viewing fear, and this was a particular phrase that I don't claim responsibility for. It's put in front of us by one of our FSANZ fellows one day, and I think it's just a fantastic way of characterising risk perception or risk experience in modern day society. And this explains why society, consumers, etc., remain pretty concerned about things like fluoridation, vaccination, topical, irradiation, glyphosate, pesticide residues, country of origin labelling, GMOs. That's I don't know what that is, that chemical symbol anymore. It's been a while, but nanotech is represented there. So these are the things that really upset consumers, and it's a function of that outrage component. Would point out that for all of these 7 or 8 topics, the science is really settled on it. These things are okay. These things are safe, but that doesn't drive acceptance at the end of the day. Recently reminded of the Dunning-Kruger effect and came across this graph, which is fantastic. So if you look at the axes, first of all, increasing confidence there from 0 confidence up to quite a lot, and on the X or Y axis, always get that wrong. Is it Y for the sky, Kath? X across the bottom? Yeah, thanks, Kath. So the x-axis, knowledge and skills, going from not very much, from ignorance through to wisdom and on to expertise. But there's this funny little phenomenon that occurs, isn't there, folks, with this graph? You take a look at the red line now, pretty early on, as you become familiar with a new situation or learn about a new thing, you get to the stage pretty quickly where you become quite confident and able to speak about it, able to share your view, because you haven't quite got to the valley of despair. You're on top of Mount Stupid there. You haven't quite got to the valley of despair, and I think most of the whānau out there today would probably recognise this effect, that when you get to this valley of despair, you suddenly become aware of, well, start to develop some awareness of what you don't know about a particular issue, and you become paralysed to an extent, because you don't you lose that confidence, because you're suddenly put in your place, you find out something else, and you realise that things aren't that straightforward. The good thing is that humans were adapted to learning. We tend to head up the slope of enlightenment and onto this promised land. So I just want to hold a thought about this relative to what you might see on Facebook from time to time, and who are the noisy people on Facebook and other such social media platforms. Thank you, Kath. So, yeah, when it comes to recognised experts over the time, we used to put a lot of faith in people in white coats, didn't we? Leading scientists, PhD students. Then things started to turn. TV got pretty big. Media experts suddenly became the revered sources of expertise in society. And strange phenomena happened in the last 10 years or so with platforms that see not centralised trust in institutions, but distributed trust. We're able to have conversations with those people in our echo chambers in our communities. And somebody like Karen, who may or may not be on top of Mount Stupid, I wouldn't like to judge Karen. Karen's had a hard enough time of things lately, but Karen, because she's one of your friends, she's a colleague, she's somebody you grew up with, etc., etc. She's somebody you inherently trust, and it's the rise and rise of Karens that perhaps presents the biggest challenge. This is David Hume, Scottish philosopher. This is actually a co-quote. David doesn't know that it's a co-quote. I don't know if you call it a co-quote, but I've amended the quote to gender neutralise it. But a wise person proportions their belief to the evidence. I think that's a really telling phrase from 200 or 300 years ago. And as I say, once you start becoming aware of what you don't know about a particular issue, you tend to then set out on that journey of learning, particularly that scientific journey about learning a whole bunch more. So in talking to Sue about this at the start of last week, Sue's quite concerned generally about the variation, aren't you, Sue, between commercial standards and government standards. And I'd point out that that science gets us an important part of the way on the journey towards decision making, but it doesn't get us all of the way. Been doing a lot of reading of Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, previous, not the current one, but Sir Peter Gluckman. And he's got a lot to say about science advice and how it fits into the policy process. A lot of great presentations. I'd encourage you to jump online and do your own homework on this one in terms of what Sir Peter Gluckman had to say. He talked about something called the electoral mandate, and that is essentially saying that if you campaign on a particular issue, then that's the decision made if you get elected. There's no point in the officials then going away and doing the research and figuring out that the decision is not scientifically robust, etc. There's an electoral mandate that comes with certain decisions, and that's why perhaps we import raw milk cheeses into the country. It's why we sell raw milk, etc. Sorry, thanks, Kath. So what I would say is that context is decisive. So values, essentially what it comes down to, values are key here, and we all have different values, and often these are disputed, and that's where things get quite fiery on social media platforms. But risk is a very personal thing, and I'll take you back to what Slovich had to say about consumers having a more sophisticated view of risk than perhaps scientists appreciate. Sir Peter Gluckman there, great quote. We face the challenge, and it's exciting times, isn't it? We face the challenge of a post-expert, post-elite, post-truth world. And this is why we can sell raw milk. I mean, scientifically, we shouldn't be selling raw milk. There's quite a bit of risk associated with it, but there's also quite a bit of judgment associated with that, isn't there, folks? Quite some experts in Campylobacter thinks, of course, that selling raw milk is just crazy, but there's a number of people out there who believe different things. Thanks, Kath. So if we just go back a little bit, that'd be great. So this is why we can also ban BPAs. We heard from Phil Bremer a couple of weeks ago that BPAs, this phenol A, is actually an ingredient in plastic. And if you listen to the dialogue, you listen to how it's represented, it pretty much sounds like people are talking about a contaminant. I think people might think a little bit differently about BPAs if they understood that it's an ingredient, because in understanding that it's an ingredient, if you take it out, then you've got to put something else in. And I wonder if the people who campaign so heavily to get BPAs, you know, who rung up Sue Wheeler at their local supermarket head office and said, you've got to get BPAs out of our food. If you understand that it is in fact an ingredient, then you've got to ask the question, well, okay, if we take BPAs out, what are we putting back in? And I see an emergence of consumer groups in the US now starting to focus on BPA replacements. Understand that a key one is BPS, a relatively close cousin of BPAs, and there's less scientific reliability about BPS than there is BPAs. Particularly government, particularly in this part of the world, we haven't banned BPAs because, yeah, whilst there is a theoretical risk, we understand that risk is, and particularly in a toxicological domain, is linked to dose. And we know that through direct measurement that the dose or the concentrations of BPAs found in food from plastics is very, very low, and on a dietary exposure basis is inconsequential. So this is why we haven't set standards. But we can also have arguments about how safe is safe. It's a great debate for those of you out there in food safety land. How safe does safe need to be? I think it's one of those real head scratches that you hopefully pretty quickly move on from and just get back to work. But it is one of those ones that you can spend a lot of time on. And I would finish with this idea that government's objective in regulation is always to do the minimum effective, to choose the option that has the greatest net benefit from an overall societal perspective, versus retailers, bless them, who are a lot closer to the customer than we, and legitimately look to ensure that they do right by their customer. And so will tend to set standards or tend to do things that are in their belief in the best interests of their customer. They certainly have brand and customer protection at the forefront of their thinking. Is that correct summary of our conversation last week, Sue?
Yes, yep, definitely. We're looking at what's right for our customers, and ultimately that's what's right for ourselves.
Yeah, great. So with those two slightly different objectives in mind, it pretty much explains why we sometimes reach some different conclusions about what standards to be setting. You get different results there. So that's a bit of a flying tour of food regulation. Super exciting time to be alive. It can get a bit depressing and overwhelming if you think about it too much, but you don't think about it too much, you just crack on to the next job. It is a super exciting time to be alive. So thanks very much for listening. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. Thanks, Glen. The first one is, do you think that some of the lack of support for irradiation was due to lack of understanding and that it wasn't explained correctly?
Quite possibly, or it could have been about people just having different beliefs, different values, different perspectives on it. People who say, no, I don't want my food processed in that way. I want to eat it fresh. Thanks very much. So it can be a real range of factors in there. But certainly, as I said, from the 460 submissions that opposed it, we definitely went through each of the individual issues and teased them out and put the FSANZ perspective, which counted each of those specific concerns. So we covered each of them off, and so yeah, hopefully, like to think that submitters have read that response and have changed their minds. Possibly some of them have, but like I say, others may have moved on by now.
And a second one from Peter Cressy. Nice presentation, Glenn. Do you think the overlap between risk assessment and risk management in your earlier slide reflects an optimal level of interaction?
Peter Cressy, that's a great question. Super question. Thank you, Peter. So the previous question was a good one too, of course. But yeah, Peter, it is got to be an iteration. It's got to be a relationship. But there's also got to be a level of independence there as well. So, we wouldn't want the risk managers sitting on top of the risk assessors saying, you can't put that in your report. We might have a question about how they've phrased a particular conclusion, but certainly there's got to be that object. We like to think there's that objectivity to risk assessment that we keep out of. In the same way that risk assessors need not be upset by the fact that risk managers might be proposing a decision that doesn't line up perfectly with the perfect science because of all of those other reasons that I outlined. So there's there's plenty of room for tension in this particular equation at the operation of those two circles, and it's really important that professional, respectful behaviours pervade the operation of that relationship.
And we've just got one quick last one, if that's okay. Thanks, Glenn, from Tim Harwood. Thanks, Glenn. You spoke about FSANZ promoting consistency between domestic and international standards. How do you approach changing the standards?
Good question, Tim. Again, thank you very much for that. So yeah, we have to have regard to domestic and internet promoting that consistency. And one of the things we do when considering any particular change to the code as we have a look to the rest of the world, see what Codex says in particular, we start there. Then we look to our traditional kind of trusted Western, dare I say it, allies for historical reasons. We look to the North Americans, we look to the Europeans. But increasingly, we're also looking up into Asia as well, because it's really important from a trade perspective as trading patterns change that we look north of this part of the world as well. So in every report that we do, we publish an assessment of what the international situation is with regard to any new standard, Tim. So open up those reports and you'll see that analysis in there.
Thank you very much, Glenn, for a most informative presentation.